Oftentimes there's a tendency for people to bury their head, mostly because they're overwhelmed by the scenario or, they don't think that they can make a change or they don't know where to start. And so I think people just say, oh, like, I'm going to just, do a little bit of avoidant technique.
Mm.
And I'm sure the same is true in leadership. Like people kind of, I am the way I am, or, this is my leadership style. And if it doesn't jive with you, then that's on you.
Yeah.
You certainly are the expert in that area, but I suspect that people kind of have that same tendency to a certain extent. My philosophy around this is more about the next action. And I think oftentimes in order to trigger somebody to take that next action, you have to get them to a moment of realization. And so a lot of the things that I work on is how do we get a person to get that moment of realization on their own?
Welcome to the New Generation Leader Podcast. We're giving you the tools you need to lead in the digital world. Ready to reach your true potential? This is the New Generation Leader Podcast.
I've been working on leadership debt as a concept. We see all of these tips and tricks and what we need to work on to get better. You read a book and it's like, oh, do this one thing, but the things all stack up. You work in the financial realm and people obviously come to you with debt, financial debt. So whether it's financial debt or leadership debt, things start to stack up in their worlds. Talk to me about what you see mentally that people have to shift to make positive changes.
Well, I think one of the things is even like when you talk about financial debt, you can talk about true like credit card debt or car loans or student loans. You can talk about that kind of debt, but there's also a debt in the sense of they may be deficient in their savings rate, or they may be deficient in just being an active participant in their finances. So like kind of playing into that same idea of like leadership debt, people have debt in their finances that's not specifically credit card debt or student loan debt or whatever. Oftentimes there's a tendency for people to bury their head, and mostly because they're either overwhelmed by the scenario or, they don't think that they can make a change or they don't know where to start. And so oftentimes I think people just say, I'm going to just, do a little bit of avoidant technique.
Mm.
And I'm sure the same is true in leadership. Like people kind of, I am the way I am, or, this is my leadership style. And if it doesn't jive with you, then that's on you. You certainly are the expert in that area, but I suspect that people kind of have that same tendency to a certain extent. My philosophy around this is more about the next action. And I think oftentimes in order to trigger somebody to take that next action, you have to get them to a moment of realization. And so a lot of the things that I work on is how do we get a person to get that moment of realization on their own? Oftentimes there's a tendency for people to bury their head, and mostly because they're either overwhelmed by the scenario or, they don't think that they can make a change or they don't know where to start. And so oftentimes I think people just say, I'm going to just, do a little bit of avoidant technique.
Mm.
And I'm sure the same is true in leadership. Like people kind of, I am the way I am, or, this is my leadership style. And if it doesn't jive with you, then that's on you. You certainly are the expert in that area, but I suspect that people kind of have that same tendency to a certain extent. My philosophy around this is more about the next action. And I think oftentimes in order to trigger somebody to take that next action, you have to get them to a moment of realization. And so a lot of the things that I work on is how do we get a person to get that moment of realization on their own? Because if I just tell them like, you need a moment of realization, like they're probably pretty resistant to that idea. And so oftentimes the philosophy that I go with is, hey, let's look at the last 3 months. And I often call this like the equivalent of going to your annual physical, right? So when you go to your annual physical at the doctor, they always take your vital signs. They want your blood pressure, they want, your temperature, they want your height, your weight. They want those vital signs. When it comes to your finances, the vital signs that you have are your income, your expenses, your savings rate, right? Like those are your vital signs. Most people, if you say, what is your income? They can give you a pretty good answer. They did their taxes in the last 12 months. So they know their paycheck comes in every 2 weeks, whatever it is. They know what their income is. If you say, what are your expenses? They can tell you what their mortgage is. They can tell you what their, bills, like their utilities or, anything that's a fixed expense. All in, what do I spend when it comes into grocery shopping and, entertainment and dining out? They don't really have a good idea. And so I will often say, let's go look the past 3 months, categorize every single expense, and then look at it and ask yourself, are you okay with the way that you spend money? And for most people, that's the realization, like, oh man, like those $13, $18, $21 at Amazon, they add up really quick. And so then people go like, I don't like that. I don't want to spend that money on those things. Same thing is true of eating out. I mean, I think eating out's got absurdly expensive. And we don't even use like Uber Eats or that kind of stuff, but that's even more expensive. But I got 3 kids, so you're feeding 5 people. You have to eat pretty much no matter where you go, minimum $50.
And as they get older and they're not in
more.
kids' meals, it's way more.
And we're kind of into that because the 2 oldest boys now, like I'm thinking about Chick-fil-A off the top of my head, like they order off the regular menu, right? And so it's like, it does get expensive. And so then, $50, like most people can go like, look, $50 is not going to make or break you, but it's not $50. Like when you zoom out and you look at a month and all of a sudden you're like, oh, we spent $700 eating out last month. And we're not talking about going from 700 to 0. We're talking about, can we get from 700 to 400, right? So I think oftentimes that experience or that practice of collecting that vital sign, looking at every single expense is the thing that triggers them to say, oh, like I need to make a change.
As you're thinking about all of those things stacking up, there's obviously the ones you listed off. Like you see them first, income, expense. But I think a lot of times leadership debt, financial debt, you talked about this, I think it was just yesterday on social media, actually a report from the White House on the hidden cost. And so there's a little bit of a gap sometimes in our realization that like, oh, well, I'm spending this and I'm earning this. But what about if you go from 700 to 400, what could you do with that 300?
Yeah.
And that's a powerful multiplier. And you talk about this a lot from a financial perspective.
Well, and my big thing is I push people to be this way because it's the way that I am in my own life. And I think it's the way that the vast majority of people are. There's certainly exceptions to the rule. I don't think that most people want to spend their life thinking about their finances. Like if you say like rank the things that bring you the most joy in your life, I don't think for the vast majority of people managing their finances makes like the top 10, right? And so the idea is, aren't your finances supposed to be a resource to allow you to live your life? And so a lot of this ends up coming back to, okay, well, how do we set up our finances in a way that gives us more opportunity to do the thing that we want to do, which is to live our life? And that can be anything, right? Like if you're a childless household, right? Like it's not going to be enjoying time with your kids, but if you're somebody like us who has kids, part of that is spending time with your kids. So I think when you look at that $300, I'm often a realist and don't say to people, hey, we can invest that $300. But I say, where's the middle ground that we can meet where some of that goes to improving your quality of life today. And some of that goes to improving your quality of life in the future. Because I mean, again, I'm quite the realist when it comes to the advice that I give. And I think our parents' generation, my parents are pushing 70. I think their generation, as a result of being the children of people who lived through the Great Depression, was very much this philosophy of get a solid job, save your money, you can enjoy it when you retire, right? Those clients that I have now, and even talk to my own parents, a lot of them have some level of regrets about not enjoying a little bit more of the fruits of their labor in the earlier years, right? I think our generation might be going maybe too far the other extreme, right? Maybe getting a little bit too close to a YOLO type mentality, but they're moving towards this place of, hey, we want to make sure that we're enjoying life today because right now or tomorrow is the closest thing I've got to a guarantee. Right? I don't want to put all of my eggs in the future basket and then not get the opportunity to enjoy it. And so I try with clients to say, well, let's find a balance in those two things. Because first of all, yeah, I agree with you. Tomorrow is the closest thing you got to a guarantee. So let's make sure it's an enjoyable day. But then second, we're hoping that we have a long life. And I don't want you to get there and become a burden on your children or a burden on society. I want you to be able to be, secure in your life and comfortable, right? And so we got to try to find a way to balance those two things. And so I think oftentimes that advice, like that debt is, okay, yeah, we saved the $300. Let's be purposeful on how we allocate it. There's also, I run into people, it's not as regularly, but I run into people who are really good savers. They, for whatever reason, the way they were raised, the way they started, they're really good savers. And I will often have a conversation with them that says, you have to find a way at some point in your life to find joy in spending money. Because what those people typically do is if they're really good savers, they've saved and saved and saved and saved and saved, and they get to, let's call it 60 or 65. And what they're used to is logging in all the time and watching the balance of their investments grow and grow and grow and grow. And in order to ever stop that cycle, they have to get to a place where they're willing to take that account that's been growing and growing and start to withdraw from that account. And at some point, theoretically it starts to decline in value. And they have to kind of get comfortable with it. That's, if you've been doing this same thing for 40 years, that's a hard dynamic to change. And so some of that in those early years is, I don't want you to, I don't want you to start overspending today. I want you to keep saving the way you are, but I do want you to find some level of comfort in the idea that these resources are intended to afford you something. And that warm and fuzzy of just having savings will not, satisfy you forever.
Have you read Die with Zero?
I think it's taking off as far as a philosophy. Like, I think way more people are, bracing it than kind of what and some of that's what I mentioned about just generational differences.
Yeah, generational dynamics. I mean, generations impacts the workplace, it impacts education, it impacts mindsets. Pew Research has done a lot of research on generations, and they're pulling back from that just because in our global world these days, generations are not as cut and dry, but we can still see some macro trends. But like you said, children of those who lived through the Great Depression, you kind of end up with this whiplash, and Die with Zero feels like a calibration. Let's dial it in and be finely tuned,
in
balanced, embrace both, figure out the right way to do it. Now, that sounds like a dance, and it sounds really hard to die with zero.
I can use my parents as an example. In an ideal world, if I got the perfect outcome, my parents would live long enough to spend their last dollar and then die in their sleep that night. Like, that's the perfect outcome, right? The chances of that happening are basically zero. I mean, first of all, like, just not a lot of people die in their sleep. But then second of all, like, the idea that they somehow spend every single dollar in the day that they were like, we went out to dinner tonight and we spent our last $51 and then, I go home and that's what happens. Like, it's just not likely. If you plan accordingly, you're probably going to survive with something. And so often the way that I look at it is, let's think about the assets that we want to have that provide us a quality of life. And so for most people nowadays, when I do a plan, I will say, this asset right here is the only asset that we consider a legacy asset, meaning that it'll be part of the estate and the kids will inherit it. You know what it is?
No. What?
A house.
Okay.
Because the reality is, for most aging people that are going to require some sort of healthcare, they don't want to do it in a facility. They'd rather do it in their own home, right? So if you can have a paid off house that you can receive care in, you don't want to have to put that at risk. You don't want to reverse mortgage it. You don't want to have to sell it off. You want to ideally live in that home. And so if we can say, oh, this asset here, I don't have any intended use for, right? But it's worth, average home in America today is over $400,000. You fast forward another 20 or 30 years, it's easy to consider that we could have $1 million homes kind of close to the average, right? So your family or your kids inherit this $1 million house that's paid off because you didn't want to have that liability on the books. That's plenty of estate, gift to a next generation. You don't need to also have X number of millions of dollars in IRAs. As somebody who deals with clients who have inherited accounts, those create nuanced challenges for the recipient. It's always more money. Nobody's like, damn, my family left me money, right? But it does require them to engage in some additional efforts. And if they've got young kids or they're at that phase of life, not the most exciting thing to have to engage in those additional dialogues. Also a conversation about estate planning here and making life easier on your kids, or grandkids, whoever it's going to be.
Yeah, it's funny. My parents have navigated the inheritance and the transition end of life for my grandparents, their parents. And so now they are building their plan based on what they don't want to pass on
experience.
To us. Yeah. All right. So you spend your time focused on finance, personal finance now.
Yep.
Take me back to the beginning. How'd you get into this?
First of all, like, I've always had an interest in personal finance. And so that kind of, like, I think oftentimes when people talk about starting a business, they're like, well, what do you like? What are you good at? And I think in hindsight, I can say that this was something I was always interested in. At the time, it never like resonated with me that like that was what made sense. By evidence of being the kid of a person who, kind of like we talked about, got a corporate job, worked at the same company for 40 years, right? Had a lot of loyalty to the company. That was kind of my philosophy. I went, graduated with my bachelor's in business in 2008. Terrible time if, you're of the age to know. Got an MBA, graduated in 2010. Job market wasn't really much better in 2010. Went to work for Boeing before they had all their drama that they've had over the past couple of years. An interesting leadership conversation there. And then took a job here in Richmond for a small, blue collar company that had, 80 trucks on the road. and I was managing 60 or so people. And then I got fired from that job. And, there's a lot of like background around what happened there and kind of, my experience with it. But it was kind of through that process that freed me up to go like, all right, well, now there's no golden handcuffs. I got a family to feel like I'm jobless. Like I can pursue whatever I want to pursue. And that's when I went the route of like, okay, well, let's see if I can start this on my own. And I think, there's a big conversation here around entrepreneurship is a struggle, like I think people often look at successful entrepreneurs 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road and go like, oh, it must be easy. And it's like, yeah, go back to year 2 and 3 when, I didn't have two nickels to rub together, like, so, it was brutal at times.
Yeah. A couple episodes back, I walked through all the books I read last year, and I don't know why I had never read Shoe Dog, but I finally did. And
I'm not even familiar with Shoe Dog.
The Phil Knight story, the founder of Nike, the years, decades that Nike went through from line of credit running out to line of credit running out, time and time again. I mean, Nike doesn't become what it is today without those years.
Without the resilience to stick it through.
But we always look at the finished product or the current iteration. So there's all sorts of myths there.
You see those all the time, especially on like the social media age now. Like you'll see that thing where it's like famous people when they made their first million. And it's always like 56, 49. And you're like, oh, like here I am, like as a 39-year-old, like judging myself about the level of success I've had. And like all these people have had a ton of success in their 40s and 50s.
So
in some ways, we're all ahead of the the curve.
You're on your own curve.
That's true.
Die with zero. Follow your own path. Create your own journey. You've had a few stops on your career. You said a smaller blue collar company.
Yeah.
You've started your own, a big behemoth corporation like Boeing. What's it been like working in each of those environments through your career?
So I was reflecting on the Boeing the other day because I was, like 22, the world was your oyster. Like you're just like excited about like, I'm starting my first career. And like I was in like accounts payable. I was like the bottom of the barrel at the office. But anytime we knew that like execs were coming in, I'd put on a suit and show up to the office that day, even though it was a business casual environment. Like nobody else was dressed up. But I was just like, there was just a positive enthusiasm about what was going on. And this was, I was going to create a future for myself. And so I just remember that we had a lot of fun, and I think that from a leadership perspective, that goes a long way. I think people kind of, the more you get enjoyment out of going to work, the more productivity and, success you have. So I think I learned some things there about kind of what I thought was the right way to have leadership. Probably also made some mistakes there as far as some communication and like not really understanding how to send appropriate emails to people and how to hold people accountable when you're not in leadership. And then the transition was tough to the small company because it was in a trade that I had no knowledge of. And so here I was expected to lead an organization where I had no knowledge of what the work that was being done with. My knowledge was in business, right? And so I was expected to come in and kind of look at processes and look at business, but how do you build rapport with a group of people who you can't do what they do? And so there was a challenge there in trying to establish, what that looks like. Ultimately, I'm kind of an open book on this particular time in my life, but I think of myself as an incredibly stubborn human being. And there's a certain way that I view leadership from just a values perspective. And I wasn't willing to bend on that. And when you work for a small company, you kind of either fall in line with ownership or you find something else to do. And for me, it ended up being find something else to do. But, you can put your head down at night and sleep and feel good about it. So I felt kind of fine about that process. But there was a unique set of challenges there. And then being self-employed, the challenge there is more of, hey, like leadership looks different. There's nobody working for you, but you're still expected to lead clients. And I would tell you today, the thing that I struggle with the most is the difference between when you have a conversation with a client, they have engaged you in a conversation where you're the trusted resource. And to leave that conversation and go into your life where you have conversations with your friends or with your spouse or with your parents. And that's not a relationship where they look at you as the trusted source, right? And so how do you flip back and forth between, in this conversation, I'm viewed as the expert and basically everybody in the room is willing to listen to what I say,
right?
To this conversation where I'm just a participant and the people in the room have no requirement to listen to what I say. They haven't even chosen to say that they think I'm a trusted source, right? Like they could just be like, yeah, Cory's out of his mind. I'm not listening to him. You know, so it's just that's like the dynamic that I struggle with more today because I don't have, you know, a team of people who I manage or lead by choice to some extent.
Well, as an entrepreneur, you get to a place where you're wearing multiple hats, doing multiple things. You become more of a generalist as opposed to a specialist. Whereas Boeing or any large corporation, you have a very narrow.
I was responsible for paying invoices that came in, but that had a vendor that was between the letters of H and R. Like, that's how specific it was.
You touched on values a little bit. I think values are so helpful to make clear decisions, to know what to do, what not to do. Vision, mission, values, all of that helps drive those. You touched on values a little bit. What values drive you and your work today?
These are the same values that drove me when I worked at the smaller organization. Can I go on to one Boeing value that I find just fascinating?
Yeah.
You know, so I'm always critical of like organizations that have like their core values on the wall, right? Because it's like you can write whatever you want on the wall. Do you live it? Number one. Number two, it has gotten to a place where it oftentimes feel like they all use the exact same. It's like integrity and like it's like there feels like there's a lack of effort,
Originality
yeah, in it. Boeing had one that when I worked there, I was like, this is the most amazing core value. And I loved it because it aligned with me as a person and kind of the way that I approached work. I'm going to tell it to you now, and then we'll dissect a little bit of how it's played out over the course of the 20 years, not quite 20 years, 15 years since I was there. The core value was finds a way. And I loved it when I was there because I think that oftentimes you work with people who are just like, I couldn't figure it out. And they just come to you looking for answers. And it's like, well, I don't know the answer either. So I'm going to go figure out how to do it. And that's what I always interpreted that as meaning. Find a way, find a way, find a way. In hindsight, given what's happened with Boeing and kind of some shortcuts they've made from an engineering and certainly from a safety perspective, find a way seems like a really terrible thing, right? But I think it's a very interesting aspect to look at these values because it could be viewed in such a positive light. And then given some of the circumstances and when leadership is unchecked on some of these things, it turned into such a bad core value. You know, my values that I think I operate so much now is I try to prioritize ahead of anything else the human aspect and try to look at the person and say like, well, what's important to this person? And some of that is always influenced by your own, you know, what matters to me. But little things, when I had people who worked for me, I always wanted to remember their wives' names and their kids' names or their husbands' names and their kids' names, right? Because those people mattered to me. And so, you know, I didn't want to just say like, how's the family? I wanted to be able to say like, how's Melissa? How are, you know, John and Sarah? Like I wanted to be able to ask you how each of those people was doing because I thought it showed that I cared about you as a person, right? And for me, it was always about trying to find a way to engage the individual in a way that made them feel valued and cared about, because the more they felt valued and cared about, the more they would care about the organization and give back to the organization. Whereas I think what ended up doing me in was the organization, and I think a lot of organizations are this way nowadays, especially with work from home and like data-driven approaches. There's this philosophy of just like, well, what was your utilization? Like, how busy were you? How much work did you get done on a metric, right? And unfortunately, for a lot of those, either the organization learns how to, or, you know, the employees in the organization learn how to manipulate some of that data, right? Here's how I can do my work. Here's how I can keep my mouse moving. Here's how I can, you know, whatever the thing is, right? And they can manipulate some of that. But also it sets the tone from the get-go that I don't trust you.
Right.
Right. And so like, well, why would the employee have an engagement in the organization when the organization has very blatantly kind of sent the signal that we don't trust you on the front end? And so, you know, my philosophy was just, I'm going to make sure that every individual feels valued on a personal level because I want them to then return that. So, you know, I had like 60 something employees who worked for me. I took every single one of them out to lunch every single year for their birthday. So I had every single birthday in my calendar. A week before, I would look up all of them. I would send all of them. And I had employees in Roanoke, in Virginia Beach. And so I was, you know, driving all over the state. But it was their opportunity to have one-on-one time with leadership, to be able to express what's working for them, what's not working for them, what differences they want. And so it was an opportunity for me to just listen to everybody. You know, and then I'd remember their names and ask them about, you know, what's going on with the kids and, you know, those types of things. But the idea was long term, I thought I could get more utilization with that approach than forcing the utilization number. I always use this analogy, but if you take a kitchen sponge, you finish doing the dishes and the sponge is saturated with water. And if we think about that from a business perspective, let's call it a water profit. There's kind of two ways you can get the profit out. You can wring the sponge and all the water will come out. But unfortunately, in that process, you rip some of the fibers of the sponge. And if you keep doing that over and over again, eventually that sponge breaks down and falls apart. Or you can just put that sponge in a warm, dry space and the process will happen naturally to get all the moisture out. But you got to be a little bit patient, right? And so my philosophy was always, let's be the person who puts the sponge in the warm, dry place and gets all the water out that way, as opposed to wring the neck of the organization to squeeze all the profits out of it. So I think that kind of contribute a lot to the values approach.
Yeah.
How do I make sure that I'm always, fostering that warm, dry place?
Well, that utilization is it's a productivity thing. It's a bottom line thing, because for so many of us, and I'm sure your MBA experience was like this, it's about numbers and what you can document and what you can look at. But oftentimes this personal side, the relational side, isn't something you can quantify or look at. But ultimately we know it stacks up, and it can either stack up in the right direction and you become one of those best of the best workplaces, or it stacks up in the wrong direction and you're hiring new people every time you turn around.
Yeah, but it requires a level of bravery from leadership. There's like a certain faith aspect there, right? Like I got to believe in this, that it's going to deliver results, because it's not immediate. That warm, dry place takes time.
Yeah.
And I think that unfortunately, we can even talk about this on a personal level, right? Like the social media, kind of world that we live in today, the 24/7 news cycle, we're an instant gratification society. Like I want it now. 2-day delivery. I was complaining on social media that Amazon Prime couldn't deliver in 2 days.
It's up to 3 days.
I was like, this is not what I paid for, right? So yeah, that's a tough dynamic to be like, I want the warm, dry place, even though it takes time.
Yes.
I'd rather just get my profits and let's get out of here, right? Like that's how a lot of people feel.
So how do you impart that approach on the financial side?
Yeah.
To be patient, to let the process do its thing. We've had some roller coasters the last
We've had some
years.
23, 24, 25, all good years. 22 was a tough year. Certainly, 2020 had, even though if you zoom out now and you look at it, 2020 was a great year for the market. It had a heck of a roller coaster ride, right? And roller coaster is the right way to describe it. And I think oftentimes I try to talk to clients in analogies in ways that I think resonate with the average person. Because I think generally speaking, giving them the research paper answer is unsatisfying, So we often, I think oftentimes it's about drawing the picture of what long-term looks like, right? It's giving them the vision of what these things compound into long-term. But then it's bringing it back to their current life. And this goes back to some of the things I said to you earlier about you wouldn't list managing your finances in the top 10 most enjoyable things. So let's try to do less of it, right? But also, we have this conversation a lot about risk and this idea of, the more risk you take, in theory, the more reward you get, right? But we have to manage risk in a way that is appropriate for you, the individual. And the roller coaster is the prime example, right? Like I always say to people, do you know who dies on a roller coaster? Most people say no. And it's the person who jumps off, right? Like if you stay on the roller coaster and you're strapped in, generally speaking, I know there's exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, you're safe, right? The same thing is true in investing. If we ramp you up too high and that roller coaster becomes too volatile, you jump off. And that's detrimental to your long-term success. The same way it is on an actual roller coaster. So I got to try to manage the risk factor, that roller coaster ride, to be risky enough that it, if we kind of tie it to actual roller coasters, it gives you that endorphin rush of a little bit of adrenaline shot. But at the same time, not so much that you say, I'm done here. I don't want to do this anymore. Right. So you're kind of constantly trying to do that. And then I think it's trying to get people to realize what the impacts of what they're saying are. So for example, if I go back March, April of 2025, right, we kind of had that tariff, the initial tariff influx, right? Market responded really negatively. I got some calls from clients that were like, hey, this seems like it's going really bad. I think I want to get out. And so the conversation I would have with people at that time is, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you're feeling apprehensive about the U.S.'s approach to, tariffs and kind of global politics, and you think that that's going to end up in some sort of negative outcome. And so you want to get out. Right now, you own, let's call it 3,000 different companies that employ 100 million people. I don't know the actual number, 100 million people. All 100 million people in those 3,000 companies have a vested interest in the success of their business because they would like to continue to be employed and continue to be able to support their family. Okay? So that's over here. You want to get rid of all of that and hold what? And people go like, I don't know. I just want to pull out and put it in cash. Well, if you put it in cash, you own US dollars. That's what you own. Now, you just told me that you don't feel good about the course of action, but you want to get rid of these 100 million people who have a vested interest in the success of the organization so that you can own US dollars that you're not really feeling that good about. And people go like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'll stick to this. So I think you have to break it down in a way that helps people understand in a logical way what their decisions are.
When you talked about this earlier, whether it's finances, leadership, running your business, whatever you're working on, we can be overwhelmed by the amount of activity on our plate, the gap of what we don't know. So however we can fill in that gap and build some scaffolding, help understand, hey, this is the exponential return on growing your business, on growing your financial investments. Whatever the growth is, there is growth potential here if you follow the plan and stick with it. But I think so few people, we haven't seen this play out. We haven't seen this play out in leadership. There's one coach or one teacher or one former supervisor we've seen, but we don't often see it organizationally. We maybe haven't gotten a full glimpse of somebody doing finances really well. And so if we haven't seen it, well,
certainly our generation, the parents did not open up the finances to show you what they were doing.
I knew there was a spreadsheet.
Yeah, but we don't talk about it.
Mom and Dad, I know you're listening. Budget futs was a thing. They had a spreadsheet. They tracked every expense. And that was what the spreadsheet was called, was budget futs. Budget futures. But now we talk about more of that. But we talked about the simple building blocks. But beyond that, how do we grow? How do we expand this knowledge? And that's often a gap. And so it sounds like you're filling gaps for your current clients in every challenge, in every wave of the roller coaster, but you're also trying to go to the root cause with kids.
Yes.
And solve this with Cash Camp.
Yep. Cash Camp, financial literacy. I think this goes back, it sounds like you had more conversations around finance in your house growing up.
A few more. My dad did work at a bank.
My dad worked in the financial industry. He was in insurance though, so it's not quite the same. But his philosophy was like, we don't talk about money, right? It was kind of like the, money, religion, politics, like we don't talk about it, right?
Yeah.
Which conceptually I get, right? But what it ended up doing was it ended up creating a generation of people who were thrust into life, and it was like, hope you can swim, right? And they just and I run into it with clients all the time. I just don't have a good understanding of finances. It overwhelms me. It's complicated, right? So Cash Camp, the idea of Cash Camp is to create foundationally, right, good mindsets around money and then good core habits, right? Are you familiar with the marshmallow test?
No.
So the marshmallow test, and I forget who conducted the study, but essentially they put a kid in a room, they gave him a marshmallow, and they said, if you don't eat the marshmallow, there's a reward. And then they left the room. And the kid was left there, I think it was either 10 or 15 minutes. And if they ate the marshmallow while they were gone, they came back and they just said like, all right, you're good. Like, see you later. If they didn't eat the marshmallow, they would give them another marshmallow. So now they kind of got interest, so to say, right? So it was a way of measuring whether people kind of subconsciously or kids subconsciously understood the idea of compound interest. And then they came back and they looked at those same people, I think it was like 20 years later, and they said, okay, what are the financial outcomes that happened for the group that waited for the extra reward and the group that wanted the instant gratification and ate the marshmallow? And it was a giant contributor to people having significantly better outcomes, right? And so what we're trying to do is, how do we figure out a way to establish some of these, concepts in kids today? And so, there's nothing overly complicated about it, right? Because sometimes I sit there and I am working on it and I'm listening to it and I'm like, this stuff is incredibly simple. But parents either are like, I don't know what to say, or I don't know how to say it, or I'm scared of saying the wrong thing, or I don't want to do the research on my own, or, whatever it is, right? And so this is an easy resource to say, hey, here's a way to have a conversation with your kid for whatever age group and establish some level of understanding about what these topics are. And then the one that's out now is for 5 to 7 year olds. It's got fun activities for the kids to do around money. your kid's kind of at that age learning about what is money. I mean, they're not really earning money. They're not spending a bunch of it.
They don't have any side hustles.
We do introduce that later on, some entrepreneurial, aspects, whether they want to set up a lemonade stand or whatever, but trying to start to understand an association with the level of effort that goes out to get the money to then purchase the thing. Because you're trying to tie like, okay, so you bought, whatever, the teddy bear. That teddy bear was, 4 hours of work or whatever it is at that age. And try to tie those things together. There's this idea, I have not done this for Cash Camp, but I've got this concept that I want to create an app to kind of accompany it. And one of the core things for the app to do is essentially set reminders so that you can have a conversation. It's like a journal, essentially. So you can go to the kid when they buy something and you kind of say like, why, there's a set of questions. Why did you buy this, right? What was the perceived value? Why did you choose this over a different option, right? Why did you find value here? And then it triggers you to ask again at some period of time later. So you go back to the kid and you say like, we're going to re-talk about the teddy bear, right? And some of that is, can the kid still find the teddy bear? If given the opportunity today, would they still buy the teddy bear? Like kind of going through this cycle, because the more you can start to understand the impact of your purchases and whether you gave yourself enough time to actually process and think about it. And, those are really valuable skills that will lead to significantly better outcomes long term. There's this whole thing on social media that drives me nuts, but it's all these people who are like, here's like 5 incredibly simple things you can do to make your kid incredibly wealthy. And it's like, contribute to your kid's custodial Roth IRA, which has a bunch of nuanced difficulties with it. But for me, I don't have a desire to leave my kid a bunch of money. Like, to me, if my kid gets an inheritance, a significant inheritance, it's a consolation prize for losing their parents too soon. Like, instead, I want to equip my kids to be successful financially. Now, if they end up inheriting something, or certainly the house, like we talked about earlier, okay, yeah, like that's fine, right? But my desire is to equip them with the skills, not give it to them. And so when I see that content, I'm like, I just don't understand this, Not to mention, by the way, like if you look at the statistics for Americans, like we're under saving for our own retirement, and I got bad news for you. Your kids got 60 or 70 or 80 years to figure that out, right? And there's people who will loan them money for college and loan them money to buy a house and buy their first car. There is nobody on this planet who will loan you money to retire. So like, if you don't prioritize the things that you're going to be solely responsible for, like your outcomes are bad. So anyway, equipping kids with the skill set to be successful as opposed to giving them the handout. And if you want to give your kid a handout, that's totally fine. It's just not my philosophy.
I think there's something really key to, you said this, you feel like what skills you're teaching to kids through Kids Camp or through Cash Camp sound simple. And they do sound simple to you and straightforward. But again, in that information gap, it's still a gap for a lot of us. And so for a lot of us, we have that skill or that script or philosophy or approach. And so it is important for us to just keep laying down the basics and the foundational building blocks to be successful.
Perhaps even more important, and in some ways more concerning, is the number of people who have the knowledge base but don't put it into practice. If they were to watch Cash Camp, they'd be like, save, spend, give jars. I'm like, I know that I should allocate some of my income to saving and some to spending and some to charity. Do they do it?
No,
they don't. Right. So it's like some of the things, like you can listen to it and you can go like Cory gave us nothing. Like, this is simple. But then if you actually took a minute to like look in the mirror, you're like, well, I don't put a lot of this into practice. So I think some of it is, not only do I think it's simple, I know it's simple. I still know how impactful it is.
And hard sometimes to change habits.
Incredibly difficult. I think you mentioned it earlier and I kind of went through my mind as we were talking, but one of the things that frustrates me is like everybody has some sort of expertise, right? Like, and it doesn't matter what you do, right? Like if you're an electrician, you have an electrical expertise that I certainly don't have. Society puts zero pressure on me to know my profession and electrical knowledge. But that electrician is expected to have knowledge societally about finances. Right. And so like, it's this weird dynamic, like for whatever reason, society does not expect any of us to have other people's knowledge. I mean, nobody's expecting you to have legal knowledge, but there is some level of financial knowledge that societally you're expected to know, right? And so I think some people are shy about hiring a financial advisor or teaching cash, like whatever it is, because there's a certain level of shame that like, well, like society thinks that I should know this stuff, you know?
Yeah. And for all those years that we didn't talk about it or kept it under the surface, we won't get into politics now, but not talking about politics, not talking about finance, probably all in the same vein. If we're not talking about it, then we're not developing healthy ways of talking about it, which is only going to hold us back.
And the big thing is, I think that talking about it more with friends would be valuable. Because I think that you mentioned it, and I think I know it's true for me in my own life. We're kind of getting to the age where you start to talk to your parents about it more, because you're now at an age where like they're like, okay, well, you've been managing your own finances for 20 years, like you're more trusted now. We're getting older in age. We need more guidance, or we want more guidance, or we want you to be more involved because, we're kind of getting more, comfortable with the idea of end of life, right? Whatever it is. And so they start to have conversations with us. But what we're not doing is having conversations with our peers. And so I think oftentimes there's just an expectation as a result of that lack of dialogue that the experience that I'm having, whether it's positive or negative, doesn't really matter, is unique to me. Yeah. I mean, I talk a lot about financial anxiety. And I think that the expectation that kind of broadly exists is that financial anxiety is something that people have when they are in bad position financially. And they could be in debt, they could be behind on taxes, they could not be earning enough, whatever it is, right? I know my own finances, and those three things don't resonate with me. But I know that I have financial anxiety. And what I've told people is there was times when we were deeply in debt, and I had anxiety about like, are we ever going to be able to figure this out? And then there's times when we've had great income and lots of savings. And the anxiety then is this all a house of cards and it's going to collapse? That's the reality of anxiety, is it doesn't only select people in certain environments, right? And I don't know what Elon Musk's anxiety is, right? If it's financial, I probably would tell him like, yeah, tough shit, pal. Like you can figure it out, right? Like I don't feel bad for you in your circumstances. But I also know that there's a lot of people in this world who would look at me and go like, I don't have a lot of empathy for your situation, but I still have anxiety. And so I think oftentimes like part of that conversation with clients is, like this is normal, right? You're a human being. This is your unique experience. This is your path, your curve.
So for somebody listening who has a path in front of them, I know this is probably overly generalist.
Yeah.
But what's your number one encouragement to people to take the first step, take a look, examine the landscape in front of them, and just start doing something about strengthening their financial house?
So I love this idea of like vital signs. We talked about it earlier, right? And the vital signs, I would get very clear on kind of a couple of data points. One is, what is my income, right? Two is, what is my expenses? That process is oftentimes about tracking 3 months worth of expenses. I'm going to say it because we're just close to it. Do not look at the month of December. It is going to be misleading. It's not a good data point, right? But if you're starting it now, just track every expense for the rest of January and go back to the first, right? And then all of February, all of March. And the reason we like to look at 3 months is because every month has kind of that like crap expense in it, right? And so we're trying to figure out what the average oh crap is in any given month, right? So I don't want you to be like, oh, well, January is not accurate because I had to get new tires on my car. Okay, well, yeah, like I get that, right? But next month it's the water heater, or, whatever. Like things are always popping up. And so doing that 3 months gets you to say, okay, here's what the expenses are, right? And then hopefully, right, you can say, here's what the income is, here's what the expenses are. That delta is the opportunity. And so now we talk about savings. And I would just strive to push you towards increasing the savings rate. Easiest kind of direct action you can take on that front, if you do have an employer-sponsored retirement plan, a 401k, 403b, TSP, whatever it is, increase that contribution by 1% every January 1st until you're maxing out the contribution. Trust me, it doesn't matter how much you're spending. This goes back to like the $50 dinner, right? That's not going to break you. That 1% per paycheck is not going to be material enough for you to have a change in outcome on a biweekly basis. So increase by 1% again next year. Some of the providers will even let you do it automatically, so you don't even have to log in. And then, kind of just thinking more long term, start to run, some calculations. And nowadays you can do it online, you can work with an advisor, whatever, but try to draw a picture of what long-term looks like. And there's some, the 4% rule and, some of this financial independence numbers. You can calculate some of these kind of loosely, but start to look at what long-term is needed to have this outcome. And then start to think about just what your goals are as far as what that looks like. Do you want to retire at 60? Do you want to, you love working and you want to work till 70? I don't quite get it, but whatever that dynamic is, start to put some thought into that. And then the last part is at least quarterly track what your net worth is. Worth is all of your assets added up minus all of your debts, and then whatever that net number is, right? And when I say assets, I mean the value of your home, the value of your car, all of your savings accounts, all of your checking accounts, all your investment accounts, your retirement accounts, like the cumulative total of all that, minus your mortgage, your auto loans, your student loans, whatever those things are, and look at your net worth and just track that over time. I think, it's great to grow your income. It's great to reduce your expenses, but outcomes are ultimately what we're trying to achieve. And so that net worth number kind of gives you a sense of what progress am I making in the grand scheme of things. So it can be a good kind of, it's kind of probably like your weight. Like if you're trying to lose some weight, tracking that, there's certainly some reasons that you shouldn't track it. And there's certainly some truth to that with net worth. If you had a really bad savings rate, but the market was through the roof, well, yeah, it's a little bit of a misleading, data point for this 1 year. But I think ultimately speaking, it's a good data point to track long-term.
Good. All right. I asked this of a lot of people. You talked about the early part of your career, going back to your 20, 21, 23, 25-year-old self. What would you tell yourself now at this point, looking back on that era?
I think I would just tell myself that it's going to get messy. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. I think oftentimes, when I got fired from the job, I went through a lot of shame associated with it because I had this association that only people who were bad at their jobs got fired. And so I was like, oh man, I must be bad at my job. And it took years of kind of reflection and work to kind of figure out kind of the dynamics that were in play there and become comfortable with that concept. And so I think I would just tell myself then, you're not as invincible as you think you are. It's going to get ugly. It's okay if it gets ugly. Keep your head down and keep going forward. I think that's kind of the big one. I think, the only other thing I would say, and this would have changed the course of my life, and I don't really particularly love that idea. But I would have told myself that the 6-figure salary in the company car wasn't going to fulfill you. Because I was convinced as a 22-year-old that all I had to do was grow my income to 6 figures and get the VP title or, whatever, and that I would have found ultimate satisfaction. And then I got all those things and I was grossly unsatisfied. It's worked out really well, so I'm not sure that I want to change that, but
as it often does.
Yeah, right.
There's got to be pain to see the sunshine.
Some days want to be like, hey, dude, that's, and I try to tell clients that now. Every once in a while I run into a young person who's like, I just want to grow. You know what happens when you earn 100,000? You get used to it. And then it's 150. And the same thing is true of net worth, by the way. I've had clients who are like, as soon as I get to 4 million, I'll feel comfortable and I can retire. And then I'm like, that's not going to be the case. And they're like, yeah, it is. 4 million comes around and they're like, I think I'd feel comfortable with 5 million. But oftentimes I say, don't tie a goal to a number because that number just becomes your new normal. And it can oftentimes, not be satisfying, which is totally counter. You talk about a SMART goal, it's measurable, right? But in finances, oftentimes, if you have it written that way and it's not more driven towards kind of what your ultimate desire is in life, it's not a good quality measure of.
Awesome conversation. Wide ranging, covered a lot. How can people get in touch with you? Sign their kids up for Cash Camp.
Follow me on Instagram, Cory, CORY, _Nichols, NICHOLS. I've been doing something on Threads and Twitter and stuff like that recently, but Instagram's where I spend the majority of my time. I think it's at Cash Camp Kids, but if you go to my profile on Cory Nichols, you'll get over there somehow.
One-stop shop.
That's right.
Cory _Nichols. We'll link to that in the show notes. Thanks, Cory. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
I love having conversations like.
Thanks for listening to the New Generation Leader podcast. Subscribe today on your podcasting platform. Download the show notes and unlock your true leadership potential at newgenerationleader.fm. Thanks for listening today, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the New Generation Leader podcast.